The Dark Universe has been born. That's the name for Universal's cinematic universe based on its classic monsters from the 30s. First up is The Mummy. Writer-director Alex Kurtzman is one of the key architects of the Dark Universe. We spoke to him at length to find out more about the project and the rules governing its creation.
It's alive! It's alive!
Kurtzman is a lifelong devoted fan of Universal's classic monsters, and while these new movies will be indebted to the horror tradition, he sees them as a genre in their own right.
I think for me, the thing that defines the Universal monsters as its own genre, separate from really even the Hammer monsters and horror film and slasher films, is that you fear the monster and you fear for the monster. And those original monster films were character films, and they were played by movie stars who imbued those monsters with a heartbreak and an agony and a pathos and an emotion that I think is so specific to the Universal monsters. I think that there was a particular scene for me as a kid that struck me from Frankenstein, and it's the scene with Frankenstein at the water with the girl. What struck me about that scene is that he so desperately wanted to connect to a human being and to be appreciated and to be loved, and in his desire to connect didn't realize he was destroying the very thing that he wanted to connect with, and that to me symbolizes what the monsters are about.
No, you're hurting me! No!
You ask a 4-year-old kid to draw Frankenstein and they're going to draw green skin and flat top head and bolts in the neck, and that's the Universal Monsters Frankenstein. And so for almost 100 years these monsters have endured, I think, because they represent something so human.
And they won't be messing with the classic designs. It sounds like we'll be seeing Javier Bardem with Jack Pierce's iconic design for Frankenstein's monster.
When we started this, we have some amazing artists working on monster designs, and we started putting together look boards for the monsters, which as an adult, to be able to do that for your job is pretty much the best thing in the world. We started, kind of taking different designs and playing around with them and saying, well, what if we remove this, and what if we add that? And it became incredibly clear, almost instantaneously, that we must not touch these monsters. If you start messing those things up, you are actually fundamentally betraying what everybody loves about them. If we're gonna make adjustments, they have to be story-based adjustments. There has to be something about the story that mandates that we make the adjustment. But, to do The Bride of Frankenstein and not have the streaks in the hair from the electricity, or to do Frankenstein without the bolts in the neck, and, would be a fundamental betrayal. And so I think the key is figuring out how to really protect and preserve and not change what is not broken,
While the idea of a shared universe brings to mind comic book movies, Kurtzman was keen to point out that the monsters got there first.
I tend to feel like the best way to build a universe is to deliver individual, satisfying films, and if the audiences like those films, the universe will begin to build itself. Obviously, Marvel did an amazing job starting with Iron Man, but people forget that the monsters were the first shared universe, starting with Frankenstein meets Wolfman. And the reason that worked was because they had already done 3 Frankenstein films, and they'd already done Wolfman films, and the audience loved both characters, and they kind of ran out of gas with those stories. And they said, well, what are we gonna do? What if we put them together? And suddenly a new story was born, and it was actually really exciting to see, and that birthed a million monster crossovers. So the monsters were the first shared universe.
In Kurtzman's Mummy, Russell Crowe plays Dr. Henry Jekyll, functioning a little bit like the Dark Universe's Nick Fury. He oversees the secret organization Prodigium, but Jekyll was never a core character in the original monster movies. Kurtzman eventually included Jekyll for very specific reasons.
I tend not to respond to worlds where a lot of characters are thrown at me before I have individual relationships with them. So the idea of bringing Dr. Jekyll into the Mummy was a real debate, because you don't intuitively think that Henry Jekyll's going to be in the Mummy. Yeah. So in our conception of the film, the idea that Tom's character Nick inadvertently opens Pandora's box and comes to understand that the mummy exists in a continuum of gods and monsters, and that the mummy may be the oldest, but there are many more. And there's an organization that has been tracking them and protecting them and hunting them and doing different, depending on the monster. It became clear that someone was going to have to introduce Tom's character to that world. And then you start to say, okay, well, it's got to be somebody who has his own relationship to evil. If I'm describing Tom's character and I say this is about a man who, has good and evil in him, he has to decide which side of the line he's going to be on. He has a monster potentially lurking inside of him waiting to explode outward. Well, I could also be describing Henry Jekyll. And so the idea that Henry is in the movie because Henry has been where Nick is going and acts as a mirror to Nick's character suddenly allowed us a real story reason to put him in the film.
Welcome to Prodigium.
While they might be keeping tabs on these monsters, it's not exactly clear whether Prodigium are the good guys, and that's sort of the point.
I think that what's interesting about the organization is you've got an organization that is, as I said, either protecting, researching, or hunting monsters run by a man who could be good or evil. So it's a somewhat unpredictable thing, even though Prodigium's agenda is ultimately to protect the world from this whole existence of monsters. There's a kind of gray area that I think is interesting, and it stays true to what I think the monster films are about. I just don't think anything is ever black and white in a Universal Monsters universe. While their intentions are good, I think sometimes you have to do really bad and scary things to serve a greater good, and maybe Prodigium will be in that position.
It takes a monster to defeat a monster.
The overarching threat is also less than clear right now. It's definitely not as simple as them fighting the monsters. We asked Kurtzman if there was indeed a big bad.
That's a very spoiler-rich question you're asking me. I can say this, the threat could come from within Prodigium. There might be other forces out there or other organizations that want to do the opposite of what Prodigium wants to do. And maybe those organizations were built by other monsters. Maybe the monsters don't all have the same agendas. Maybe they want very different things. Maybe some want to bring the evil into the world while others want to protect the world from it. So I think, if you look back at the original monster films, all the monsters actually did want different things, and that's the juice. That's where you get your conflict.
Despite a lot of the original films taking place predominantly in London and a mythic version of Europe, the Dark Universe will be a globe-trotting franchise.
These are global films, so it's going to be dependent on the nature of each monster. Some of the creature from the Black Lagoon is the Amazon. So it's all about figuring out what is the nature and the mythology of each monster and figuring out a setting. But our whole design is to make these global films.
Even though there's more movies and characters to set up, there isn't a teaser for the next installment of the Dark Universe at the end of The Mummy, and don't expect any in the future either.
No, that's Marvel's domain. Maybe it'll feel more appropriate down the line as the universe builds itself, but I don't think any of us wanted to be accused of ripping off what they did so well.
It's about damn time.
Kurtzman says he wants to attract the best actors to play the monsters, and he thinks it's a more attractive proposition than any superhero role.
If you ask any of the actors that we've now got into the universe, Johnny Depp, Javier, Russell, Tom, they will all tell you a similar story about watching the Universal monsters as kids and being terrified and how much they loved them. Look at it from their point of view, okay? You can play superhero, pretty, square-jawed superhero, flaws that are interesting but often not wildly deep. Or you can play a character in which the assumption is that the character will be broken, damaged, violent, upset, scary, and there is no expectation that the character will be fixed by the end, because if they were fixed, they wouldn't be monsters anymore. It's a very, very enticing idea for an actor. If you're making movies at the studio level, at the scope and scale, how often do you get the chance to make a movie about complicated gray areas?
Johnny Depp has been announced as the Invisible Man, but there's no standalone film on the cards for him yet. So we asked if he'll debut in Bride of Frankenstein.
You'd have to see. Just pay for your ticket to see.
Well, that's probably a yes then. Bill Condon will direct Bride of Frankenstein. He's the man behind 1998's Gods and Monsters, a biopic of James Whale, the director of Universal's original Frankenstein. And as Kurtzman is currently scouting potential directors, we asked what he's looking for.
Obviously, fandom is a huge part of it, So let's take Bill Condon, who's directing Bride of Frankenstein. You're talking about a director who understands the nature of what it means to make a monster movie at the DNA level, but also what those monsters represented to that director, to James Whale. His connection and affinity for Bride, and the way he represented her, and the way he represented Frankenstein in Gods and Monsters, told all of us that it wasn't even a debate, about who should be directing this movie, because you're talking about someone who just in their DNA understands it. I think that it's all about figuring out who speaks to the spirit of these films, who understands them the most, and which writers come up with takes that are, and we work with the writers to do that, that are honoring the tradition and the heritage while bringing something new to the table. And it's hard, we don't want to make these movies until they're worth making, until they're right.
And while we're on the subject of Gods and Monsters, it's a line uttered by Dr. Pretorius in Bride of Frankenstein.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
It crops up in The Mummy, and Kurtzman said it with us a few times. There's something about the phrase that seems to carry more significance for this fledgling universe.
It depends on how you interpret a god. The Egyptians interpreted a god, but as Henry says, evil has many names. Take Set, for example, known to Egyptians as a god of chaos, whereas other cultures call it this or that. Really, we're all talking about the devil. I think the idea would be that every culture has a way of translating a mythology, and sometimes we call them gods and sometimes we call them monsters. And I think as the universe expands, we will begin to understand what that really means.
I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you.
And even though The Mummy isn't a full-blown horror movie, Kurtzman wants the Dark Universe to push the scares as much as possible.
The movies that I loved growing up were the movies that walked right up to the line of R, and where you feel like they hold you in that state of suspense and terror, but they don't always cross it. Obviously, the most notable example being, seeing Raiders as a kid, and that's a really scary movie, and it was the guy's face melts at the end. You're like, what? At 8 years old, that's shocking, but it's so appropriate to the story.
Good.